our order of presentation will go from Professor Loosely first, and then Ms. Yang Fan, and then hope Patrick will give us his punchline, as you always did. I just cannot help to read this brief bio of Professor Loosely, which is very, very impressive. And he's a former Australian senator and the General Secretary of NSW. And he has served quite a few very high-profile positions, including, like I said, the chairman of Australia Strategic Policy Institute, a senior vice president for the European Australia Business Council, and he also has been 8 years as chairman of the committee for Sydney, and he's now a deputy chair of the Asian Society in Australia. Obviously, we have a top expert here, give us his analysis on this issue from Australia's point of view. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to the Asia Society here in New York for extending the invitation. When the Society in Australia received the invitation, we determined that it would be valuable from an Australian perspective to have a voice at this gathering, given the significance of the South China Sea to Australia in the very direct sense. About 57% of our trade passes through these waters, and of course we have important concerns of a security nature and of political and diplomatic engagement in the region, where Australian friendships are very broad and very deep. I must say, Professor, you're too kind in addressing me as Professor. It's not a status I've yet attained, but the courtesy American title Senator is always welcome. Could I begin by talking about the paper that I've submitted for publication, entitled "The Art and Architecture of Solutions for the South China Sea." Talking in terms of art and architecture rather than a scientific approach, this is a matter of innovation and creativity for policymakers, including many of the people who have spoken at this conference and are in attendance today. Fortunately, we do have time in which to work through solutions based on mutual trust and goodwill, which needs to be built over time. Mr. Chairman, I begin with an anecdote which is told by Dr. Henry Kissinger. In conversation with Chairman Mao Zedong in the early 70s, around 1973, they were talking about Taiwan. And Mao said, if you, that is the United States, sent Taiwan back to China now, we really wouldn't want it. It's full of counter-revolutionaries. They don't like me very much, so perhaps in 100 years we might be looking to recover Taiwan. Kissinger duly made note of this. He confirmed it in the conversation, and Mao repeated, 5, 10, 20, 100 years we'll seek to recover Taiwan. So then fast forward, ladies and gentlemen, to the 90s. Dr. Kissinger is again in Beijing, but this time he's talking with Jiang Zemin. And he said to him, in conversation with Chairman Mao, he said he made the point that in 100 years, China might want to see Taiwan reincorporated in the People's Republic. Is that still China's position? And Jiang said, no. Kissinger was a little taken aback by this, and he said, no, well, what is your position? And Jiang said, well, when you had that conversation with Chairman Mao, that was 23 years ago. So there are only 77 years left. Now, I make that point in terms of if we look at solutions for the South China Sea disputes, solutions for the issues, we ought not to be looking in anything under a decade. To begin, what's missing at the moment, and wherein lies the greatest danger of misadventure or a miscalculation, is obviously a lack of trust. There's a great deal of suspicion, there's a great deal of mistrust. Fortunately, ladies and gentlemen, in politics and diplomacy, it is not necessary for us always to reinvent the wheel. There are a number of examples. There's a number of examples taken from the Cold War which were very successfully implemented as confidence-building measures over time, which served to minimise risk, to avoid incident, and to mean that even when there were very real differences between the powers, be it in the bilateral relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union or in multilateral relations, confidence-building measures came into play to minimise the possibility of the outbreak of a conflict. For example, in 1972, the Treaty on Incidents at Sea. And over time, practice developed of various navies, be they NATO, be they Warsaw Pact, various air forces and the like, advising each other of exercises, of passage, of the need for transit. So there could be safe manoeuvring, for example, so that the risk of collision, for example, was absolutely minimised. It even got to the point towards the end of the Cold War where there was such early advice of impending military exercises that the possibility of this being misread as something hostile was really reduced almost to zero. There is no reason why in the South China Sea, over time, we couldn't see the kind of confidence-building measures that worked during the Cold War start very modestly and then build successfully. The kind of confidence-building measures that worked for the best part of half a century introduced. That simply serves to see a pattern of events, a pattern of conduct grow, and confidence ensues, trust ensues, and suspicions can be reduced. Now, at the moment, people will need to be persuaded that these steps need to be taken. That's understood. But over time, these kinds of measures can be introduced, leading to the arrival of a very consistent and constant communications channel or series of communications channels that dramatically takes the risk of miscalculation and misadventure out of play. Now, one of those confidence building measures, of course, is one-and-a-half-track diplomacy. Now, the institute which I'm privileged to chair in Canberra, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, participates very actively in these kinds of steps. What the Asia Society is doing here today and elsewhere is another example in terms of bringing people together to endeavour to forge something of a consensus of view, perhaps even on solutions today. If we can see that kind of development occurring over years, I know, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a microwave age where we expect to be able to take the meal and bang it into the microwave and in 2 minutes it's done. Well, that simply doesn't work in politics and diplomacy, no matter what we may see in Washington, DC or in Canberra in Australia. It takes consistent effort over time, and we must expect setbacks from time to time. It simply means we need to reset the agenda, be a little more creative and come back to the table. And Australia's in the fortunate position of having first-class relations with ASEAN, with China, with the United States, with Japan and Korea. So we can play a useful role in these deliberations. The CBMs are in place, are beginning to take effect. I then think it's more than possible to take Deng Xiaoping's notion of putting the sovereignty questions to one side from memory when this was first embraced as Chinese policy, and Premier Li Peng went off to Singapore and put it into the public domain. It was a very real innovation. Put the sovereignty issues to one side, look at joint economic development, look at being able to access the resources, be it oil, gas, other sources of potential wealth in the region in a cooperative way. And we've seen that not only in terms of what's happened, so Malaysia was mentioned with Vietnam yesterday. In the Australian context, we have a relationship with Timor-Leste in terms of joint economic development in the Timor Sea exactly on the issue of oil and gas. This has been negotiated successfully. Both countries seem more than satisfied with the result in terms of being able to access the oil and gas. Sovereignty questions can be put to one side to be debated and resolved at a later date. Given that kind of development, the Australian government is particularly impressed, and I think Australian policymakers on both sides of the political aisle at home are impressed by the success of the Antarctic Treaty, which for a half century or so has served through all the signatories observing its imperatives to have the continent demilitarised, nuclear weapons in particular being banned. It's been open to scientific research. It's been most successful in terms of the commitment of scientists to understanding more about the continent and the environment. The environment has been kept very largely pristine, and it's been maintained safely, free of encroachments of any serious kind. And that's been proven to work for all the signatories to the treaty. Australia has a particular stake there, but a lot of other countries have a stake in that too. And it's an example of how a multilateral solution creates a framework for dealing with issues. Take other issues completely off the agenda. And there's no question in the region how a treaty along those lines, developing protocols, negotiated over time, takes conflict issues out of the potential for the future and focuses upon very positive and very constructive approaches. So Australia likes in particular the Joint Economic Development Zones and likes the way that the Antarctic Treaty System has worked. Came into force in June of 1961. There were 12 countries that signed it at the time, objectives being, as I mentioned, to demilitarise, to promote international scientific cooperation and to set aside disputes over sovereignty. And it's worked. There's no magic bullet in any of this, as people are aware. But if we have these measures and we build these platforms over time, we can then look to the approach that I mentioned in a question to Chris Hill yesterday. Where do we have the vehicle in our region of the world for resolving these issues by discussion and deliberation over time? Now, it is true there is an alphabet soup of multilateral organisations in the region, and there's everything from the EAS to APEC. Ambassador Hill said he liked the idea of the ASEAN Regional Forum being given a security task as well as its existing political and diplomatic requirements. That may be a very useful way to go, but what we certainly need in the region to engage all the stakeholders is the kind of regional architecture that allows some open plenary discussion, but more important, a series of corridor discussions and bilateral discussions for working these issues out. Currently, the best vehicle may actually be the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. That's simply a practical observation. But the ASEAN Regional Forum recommends itself for the kind of regional security architecture that does serve as a vehicle for solving problems. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to end on a light note here. I made the point there's no magic bullet, but having made reference to confidence-building measures from the Cold War, I'll just tell a story to illustrate the point. And it's a story of the Warsaw Pact and Prague and Leonid Brezhnev. After the Prague Spring was suppressed by the Soviets in 1968, people may recall, the Czech Communist Party became the most servile in Eastern Europe. There was a Warsaw Pact conference in Prague in the early 70s. the Czech communists decided that they would really demonstrate their fealty in the final conference dinner. So they laid on the finest china and the finest glassware, and they found some solid gold cutlery that had belonged to the Habsburgs from the imperial time. All of this was laid out. The dinner took place at the end of the conference in a castle overlooking Prague, Hrajany Castle overlooking Prague. Leonid Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, is at the top table, much the same way we are here today. And he's looking out during the quiet moment, and he sees over in the corner the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu picking up a gold spoon. Ceausescu was, of course, a kleptomaniac, as people are aware. Ceausescu waited for a moment or two until he believed he wasn't being observed by anybody. Brezhnev continued to watch him. Ceausescu took the gold spoon and bit it to see if it was real. And then again, thinking no one was observing him, quietly slipped the gold spoon into his left-hand coat pocket. Now, Brezhnev was intrigued by this, and he leaned forward and he picked up a gold spoon himself. But by this stage of his life, he was so enfeebled and his hand shook so badly that the spoon hit the wine glass in front of him, which of course is the universal signal for speeches. So the two KGB bodyguards behind him stepped forward and lifted him to his feet. That was their job. I was telling this story at the Soviet embassy in Canberra one night, ladies and gentlemen, and the Soviet ambassador leaned across to me and said, "Stephen, it wasn't quite like this," which confirmed in my mind it was exactly like this. So Comrade Brezhnev is standing in front of the assembled gathering of several hundred communist dignitaries, and there's dead silence. They're waiting for him to begin the speech. He still has the gold spoon in his hand. But he recovered. He showed the kind of dexterity that had him come through Stalin's purges. He said, "Comrades, as communists, as true communists, we cannot believe in religion. However, we can believe in magic." He said, "And tonight I'm going to show you some magic. I have in my hand a gold spoon. I'm going to hold it up so everyone can see it, and I will pass it from my right hand to my left hand. I pass it back." And he said, "I am now putting it in my right-hand coat pocket where I will make it disappear. But it will reappear in the left-hand coat pocket of Comrade Ceausescu." Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, there's no magic in this. It's a decade or more of painstaking diplomacy to demonstrate to all concerned in the South China Sea, be it China or ASEAN, be it other stakeholders like Australia, be it the United States, which has important interests in the region, that it's in everyone's interest to minimise risk, to take misadventure and mishap off the table, to lead to an overall framework for solution that means peace and prosperity is guaranteed. There will be setbacks. We will need to return to the table. But as Mrs. Thatcher was fond of observing, some battles are so important, they're worth fighting more than once. Thanks very much.
Senator, in a very light attitude, addressed a very serious issue in the South China Sea. That is, despite all those disputes and so on and so forth and tensions, there is a lack of architecture or structure for people to come together to talk to each other, build up confidence, eventually find a way out. I think that's it is in all the international conflict or tensions like this. The architecture by which people can try to find a solution is a foundation for way out, and I really enjoy his presentation. Next, we go to Ms. Yang Fang, and she's a research associate at the center, our center, Center on Asia and Globalization. Before that, she was a research associate at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And of course, this is where she found her interest, that is maritime security in Asia Pacific. And Yang Fang, please.
Sorry.
That's right.
Oh, you have to do the PowerPoint? Okay, then let's go back.
my great honor and the pleasure to speak at this conference, especially among the leading panelists and all the very distinguished experts here. And my topic is, as shown in the slide, the South China Sea dispute with a solution. Is quite a broad and very challenging topic for me. So my argument is also quite straightforward. I also argue that there's no solution for the South China Sea dispute in the foreseeable future. Instead, the claimant countries, they need to concentrate on the dispute management mechanism and confidence building measures and try to break the deadlock of the situation in the South China Sea. So this is my framework of today's presentation. I will have go through three parts. First, I will have a very brief overview of the recent incidents since 2009. And second, I will have an overview of three existing approaches taken by the claimant countries, their effort to try to reach a conclusion or the solution for the South China Sea dispute. The third will go back to the South China Sea issue of management, how to prevent the conflict and to build up the confidence. And the recent tension since 2009, there's a heightened tension. Countries, they lock in action and reaction dynamic. And as a result, they reached an impasse in the South China Sea. And we have seen that there are increasing number of incidents involving energy exploration and fishing activities in the South China Sea. So these are the three approaches I'm going to talk about. The first is the multilateral approach within ASEAN. The second is the strategic balance by involving external powers. And the third will go through the legal approach. Forgive me if I have some overlap with our yesterday's discussion. So the first multilateral approach within ASEAN. This one I would like to elaborate some the existing effort taken by some Southeast Asia claimant, their effort to try to unify the whole ASEAN and try to get the support from the member states and try to place the South China Sea on top of the ASEAN agenda and to engage China on a multilateral basis. However, I have to argue that this approach is failed, is ineffective or infeasible to reach the solution. The first reason is the Chinese strong opposition. The Chinese always maintain the fundamental position that the South China Sea sovereignty dispute can only negotiate it on a bilateral basis, although it's open for the multilateral cooperation for non-traditional security issues. And I go through the particular countries in the Southeast Asia. First, the two claimant countries, Vietnam and the Philippines, they have tried every effort to seek support from ASEAN. But Malaysia and Brunei, they tend to be relatively quiet. And also other non-claimant countries, they stick to quite neutral position as a whole. But individually, they held very diverse interests and different levels of relations with China and the US. The recent, the Philippines initiative to submit the South China Sea dispute to international tribunal has received a very low response from the ASEAN other member states. So they tend to be very quiet on this issue, and they doesn't want to openly support or oppose the Philippines' decision. And the inability to reach a consensus on the South China Sea issue has been heightened in the failure to reach a consensus or joint communique on the 45th annual ministerial meeting in Cambodia. The discord over how to address the South China Sea issue was the main reason to lead to the failure. So the as a result, I would argue that the ASEAN approach it failed to receive to achieve the solution for the South China Sea. But having said that, this doesn't mean that ASEAN is inactive in the South China Sea issue. ASEAN does have a role to play to facilitate the conduct of dialogue among the claimant countries, and they have a role to work together to achieve a final version of COC, and also to better implement the existing DOC and try to restrict any unilateral actions that could jeopardize the situation in the South China Sea. So the second approach is the strategic balance by involving external powers. External powers has been recognized as the interest party in the South China Sea, and they have been perceived as support to balance against China in the South China Sea. But the Chinese always opposed the external involvement. They argue that the external involvement can only muddy the issue and embolden the claimant countries to challenge against China. But Vietnam and the Philippines is quite naturally that they try to seek the support from external powers. However, the Vietnam also maintained a very pragmatic relationship with China, especially the party-to-party relationship. Philippines, as Ambassador mentioned yesterday, is understandable that it's one of the weakest military and economic power in the region. There's no opportunity to face up the challenge against China. So it's as an ally of the U.S. in the South China Sea and in the region, it's quite natural to seek the support from the U.S. But to the Philippines' disappointment, the U.S. purposely keep the ambiguity over its obligation to defend the South China Sea based on the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, especially when the confrontation between China and the Philippines over the Scarborough confrontation and quite recent last year. So it's also quite it failed to achieve the Vietnam and the Philippines objective. Malaysia and Brunei, they are relatively quiet on the external policy support. They don't seek so strong support from the external powers. And there are also different attitudes among non-claimant countries. There are different levels of welcome or resistance. Even from the external parties' perspective, they also feel that especially the U.S. People to Asia policy is facing a paradox. Some experts may argue that the U.S. was engaged in the issue. Some regional countries, they seek the support from U.S. But when the U.S. stepped in, they also implored the U.S. to take a step back. They are quite concerned that the major power relationship, the tension between China and the U.S. could play at the heart of ASEAN. So it's all the different parties, there are different kind of concern. So as a result, the strategic balance by involving external powers also failed to a certain level. And I will go through the legal approach. I know that I'm not in any position to explain the legal issues, especially yesterday we have our Professor Beckman and the Zhang Xinjuan as other leading experts have elaborated a lot on this issue. But I just try to highlight one point, that the Philippines submission to UN, I argue that it's more possibly to achieve the political impact, try to put China to in disadvantageous position, especially when China choose not to participate or not to enforce the ruling decision, that the Philippines would properly to seize the moral high ground. But still the legal, the submission to the UN based on the UNCLOS articles is not aimed to resolve the sovereignty issue, as argued yesterday. Prof. Beckman has mentioned that before. So all the three approaches I mentioned before have not effectively achieved the objective. So ultimately, the South China Sea issue become an issue of management. I would like to focus on two mechanisms. The first is the better implementation of DOC and the continued effort on the negotiation of COC. And then the second is the joint cooperation, not only on joint exploration of resource, but also on some non-traditional security issues. Based on my observation, I found that DOC does play some rules since 2002. From 2002 to 2009, DOC at least achieved two objectives. First is it managed to prevent any major conflict among all the claimant countries, especially the military conflict. The second is it prevented any new occupation of the land features in the South China Sea. However, it's still not a legally binding document, and ASEAN and China, they are committed to update the document and try to negotiate over a legally binding COC. But before the conclusion of COC, there are three major differences between China and the ASEAN countries. First is COC, an instrument to resolve territorial disputes. Yesterday, Prof. mentioned that it shouldn't be aimed to resolve the territorial dispute. Why? This has been tested in the Philippines proposal to ASEAN in January 2012. The Philippines proposed to transform the South China Sea into a zone of peace, freedom, friendship, and cooperation, and circulated a draft of COC to the ASEAN member states. But the proposal envisages a possibility to conduct joint development in the South China Sea, and it requires all claimant countries to clarify their claims, distinguish the disputed area and the non-disputed area, and also they are required to fully resolve the South China Sea territorial and jurisdictional disputes, and also to establish dispute settlement mechanism. However, after reviewing the first draft, the ASEAN member states they don't support the Philippines proposal. They reworked and significantly dropped the reference to the above mentioned points. So this is the experience of why the COC shouldn't be aimed at achieving the solution for the South China Sea. The second difference is over when is the proper time to discuss the formulation of COC. China claim that it should be done when the conditions are ripe. The Chinese they are willing to negotiate over a COC, but they have the priority to implement the DOC, and rather than concluding the COC. The third difference is over when is the proper time for China to involve in the negotiation. China wants to be involved in the very early stage, but ASEAN members, they say they need to consult among each other before they talk to Chinese. But they managed to make some compromise on this issue. In the first stage, ASEAN member states, they consult with each other, but at the meantime, they also communicate with China through the chair of ASEAN. And although there are differences of this process, we still recognize some progress that on the negotiation, the drafting of COC. The ASEAN member states, they managed to identify some of the key factors on the drafting of COC by May 2012, and they also the Indonesia also circulated the first draft to the member states in September 2012. And the second is the joint cooperation. I think there are many both political and economic imperatives for joint cooperation. The political negotiation for solution is quite a protracted process, but pending the final solution, there are growing resource demands and increasing number of incidents involving resource exploration and fishing activities. And at the meantime, countries, they are also facing common threats at sea. Threats such as navigational hazards, natural disasters, piracy, smuggling actions, and marine pollution and other non-traditional security issues. There are also legal bases for cooperation. The UNCLOS, they set provisions to encourage parties to reach provisional agreement in a transitional period pending the final solution of the dispute. And it also has an article to encourage countries bordering enclosed and semi-enclosed area to conduct cooperation. I will not mention some of the precedents that successful precedents. Yesterday, some of our speakers has mentioned the bilateral level, the Malaysia and Vietnam, and also Professor Stephen Losby mentioned the Australians' successful experience in conduct cooperation in Antarctic and also East Timor Sea. So, but there's one case that involved trilateral parties involved Vietnam, China, and the Philippines in the South China Sea, but eventually it failed. Still, we can learn some lessons from the experience. In 2005, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines, they concluded agreement to conduct a joint marine seismic undertaking. And however, the Philippines suspended the project in 2008. They argued that the area is largely located in the Philippine claimed area, and it could jeopardize the Philippines' interest it could weaken its position to claim its own sovereignty in the area. And there are also some very complicated domestic issues, some of the national sentiment involved in this issue. So, but still, this case could provide very valuable lessons for the future conduct of joint cooperation. I would like to, in my own point of view, that the joint cooperation before starting the direct party involved, they need to reach certain level of agreement, such as the area of cooperation, the parties who are the legitimate parties involved, the mechanism, and also the how to share the revenues. So that I come to my conclusion that the rise of China and the gap of the economic and the military power with China made other claimant countries more worried about the South China Sea dispute, the situation in the South China Sea. However, the ASEAN countries, they are also working on different pages, and they cannot reach consensus on the South China Sea. The involvement of external parties have also been received with different level of trust and suspicious among ASEAN countries. But the availability of seeking a resolution through international court or the tribunal based on the international law or UNCLOS is also very low. And the claimant countries, they need to move beyond the action-reaction dynamic and try to continue working on the COC and exploring a possibility for joint cooperation. However, both initiatives, they need to sufficiently consolidate interests of all direct parties concerned and have to insist on the ASEAN's central role and their collective effort in facilitating the process. So that's all for my today's presentation. Thank you very much for your time and the patience.
And now we are moving to our third presentation, which also is the last one for the entire conference. And we're lucky to have a top expert, not just on South China Sea issue, but also on the whole range of security issues in Asian Pacific. And we have Dr. Patrick Croney, and he's currently a senior advisor and senior director on the Asian Pacific Security Program at the Center of New American Security. And he has been working on all those issues in the past 30 years. And before this position, he was a director for the Institute of National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He also held other senior positions at the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies and also at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C. And he's a go-to guy and on issues like this. Let's give a grant for Dr. Croney.
Professor Huang, thank you very much. First, let me join everyone else in thanking the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, as well as the Asia Society, for putting together really a top-notch two-day conference, during which I've learned a great deal. I do have to, though, begin with the observation that I was here last June, as Andrew noted, and I said at the time that a confluence of geopolitical, resource competition, domestic political issues were going to continue to fuel confrontation and tension in the South China Sea. About the only thing that's changed during that nearly year period is that now almost everybody has said that, and that I feel like I'm in very good company, that the issues are complex, dangerous, unripe for immediate solution, but I would argue that most people see these things as manageable. And that's the key word we can sort of hold on to here and start to think. We do have to note that in some ways since last June, problems have actually gotten worse. There has been actually a deterioration. When you think about China's neighborhood policy having a sharper edge to it, the maritime disputes that have not been confined to the South China Sea, but there's a conveyor belt of perception between the East and the South China Seas that has developed, that the global fragmentation that is occurring in many ways requires stronger regional institutions, and yet at this point, as we heard from Walter Lohman, among others, ASEAN is not necessarily getting stronger. It's being certainly challenged in terms of even its core values, as Professor Huang presented yesterday. China's dismissal of Manila's pursuit of the third-party arbitration process is also not the kind of positive signal that the region is looking for. Even U.S. reassurance, while requested, as Yang Feng pointed out, has not necessarily led to an alleviation of concerns on many of the states, including the most exposed states, which want greater clarity, less ambiguity from the United States. And finally, the United States is still needs to further address the issue of how to achieve a relationship with China and the Xi Jinping new leadership that is more cooperative in its elements than competitive. And that's a major foreign policy and security issue on the U.S. policy agenda right now, and I suspect on the China agenda as well. And in many ways, I was asked to talk about what the U.S. and China can bring to a way forward. I want to talk about why I'm optimistic first. I'm optimistic because there's so much at stake economically for the U.S. and China and the region and the world. This is the crossroads of global commerce, freedom of navigation. Politically, there's a great deal at stake in terms of preserving the ASEAN way, the presumption of the non-use of force as a core value, as a way to build upon this political and economic community in ASEAN, which is really just on the cusp of achieving international stature as Asia rises generally. And strategically, I'm driven to the imperative, if not optimistic, in the sense that others have noted that America's dominant role, including its maritime role, is perhaps susceptible, maybe most susceptible to being challenged in Asia by a rapidly expanding China in the South China Sea. And so this is a very important area. This is indeed the topic of this entire conference, is called, for a reason, South China Sea central to Asia-Pacific peace and security. At the outset of this conference, Ambassador Stapleton Roy importuned us to deploy wisdom in statecraft. He said wise and responsible behavior were what is most needed. I totally agree with that. Indeed can quote Chairman Mao as well as Stephen Woosley, to the point that without sacrifice there will be no victory. Or as a Catholic theologian I like to read has put it, the universe does not respond to the first murmured request. It does, as Senator Woosley pointed out, take time. You have to keep working and persisting at things that you really wish to achieve. So it seems to me especially this is true when we're talking about institutions, norms, and the rule of law. I think Professor Oxman yesterday definitely synopsized how we arrived at our current understanding of the law of the sea from Grotius to the present. And there have been a lot of turns and important evolutions and milestones. It didn't happen overnight. And Professor Beckman also then demonstrated the complexity of how this law applies to the South China Sea and how the law has advanced our understanding, but also in some ways set us back by some of its vagaries and the difficulties that are there, including over defining a rock or an island and what can sustain human life. And Professor Zhang of Tsinghua University underscored how the law leaves open very different interpretations, but also how China has embraced, in many ways, international law, including third-party arbitration and things like the World Trade Organization disputes. And that's a very encouraging sign that Jerry Cohen has pointed to. And I have to say he is an inspiration because of his relentless quest to find intelligent, rules-based solutions that can allow international fair play and give equal protection to the weak and strong alike. And that's really what we ought to find common ground on. So what is the way forward? 4 ideas, nothing that you haven't really heard, but let me give you my spin on them. Because there is no one panacea, there's no one thing we can do here to tackle this array of issues. Very different steps can be taken. Many of them can be supported, some can be led by U.S. action, by U.S. and China cooperation, by U.S., China, and the region cooperating to reduce problems and to enlarge cooperation. Really, we've gone in 2 different directions in this whole discussion on the South China Sea. Some of them you get into very narrow detail, and some of them are very broad in the geopolitical. So we're covering such a wide set of views, 2 ends of the telescope, if you will, that no one view is right. It's a matter of trying to appreciate different perspectives on this. And I'm a big believer in interdisciplinary thinking and thinking that no one discipline is self-sufficing. And that's not always welcome in some academic departments, I know, but I think it's very important when we talk about the political alphabet soup that exists in terms of regional institutions in Asia that have been put together by politicians and economists and political scientists. Well, we've got the Law of the Sea Convention and all of the other legal arcane details that have been put together by lawyers. And they're both very rich and well thought out, and we have to respect those bodies of expertise and find out what is best in them and figure out how to mobilize them towards some common political purpose. And so my first way forward is to advance international law. And yes, that's a call first here in the United States for maybe repeating what State Roy talked about, that the moral advantage has certainly been lost by the United States by not embracing UNCLOS, even while UNCLOS doesn't deal with some of the sovereignty issues or doesn't necessarily guarantee that these issues go away. In fact, they won't go away just because of that. But it becomes a helpful process that we're missing the opportunity. The biggest critique in Washington against UNCLOS from my conservative friends is that it would open up an unaccountable, faceless, bureaucratic international institution over which we'd lose control. This is the basic argument. And I'm also against a faceless, unaccountable bureaucracy. We should all be trying to make and build effective institutions. So it's not a trivial concern, but I think we lose the opportunity to shape that bureaucracy, to shape that institution by staying outside it. So I can't say this solves all the problems, but I think it does more good than harm, and that's why we need to be part of it, pushing in there shoulder to shoulder. The international law can be advanced through conferences as well, building on. U.S.-China could pick up the legal framework issues here, as well as a region-wide institution like the ASEAN Regional Forum for looking at some of these issues. Walter Lohman called for outside parties to Southeast Asia, at least in ASEAN, holding an international conference on some of these dispute resolution mechanisms, and I think that's an excellent idea. And the third-party arbitration in particular that Jerry Cohen has emphasized, I think is really something that we need to study and understand and figure out how we can advance that idea, because everybody has a vested interest in these claims one way or the other. So we're going to need to find third-party arbitration and use it, because it is the tried and true means of resolving so many disputes across different fields in history. The second main way forward is to reinforce existing institutions. I as well don't want to start a brand new institution. I want to strengthen and find the best places within existing institutions. And this is where I like to build on ASEAN centrality, even if it is shaken to some extent. And that's not just ASEAN, although ASEAN obviously needs to carry on with a code of conduct and keep working that. We on the outside can't wait for that to be signed, or to become binding. So we ought to be reinforcing the ASEAN Regional Forum dialogue, as well as the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus process, where you can bring together the defense officials, as well as Senator Loosely mentioned, the Track 1.5 or Track 2 approaches of the Shangri-La Dialogue and other institutions that can bring these places together. I think from a United States perspective, the rebalancing, which had so much of a military flair, is now got a very heavy economic and trade focus, and the goal of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will hopefully reach a milestone in Singapore later this year. Very important for the United States. That kind of economic engagement shows the stakes that the United States has, but also the priority that the U.S. really wants to achieve. That is open commerce, wider commerce, rules-based commerce, from which we can all benefit, an inclusive system that protects intellectual property. Third and fourth points, and then I'll end. The third one is we have to address the growing military capabilities in the region. This is a region, after all, as the International Institute for Strategic Studies reported last year, that has transcended Europe for the first time in recent history in terms of overall defense spending. Every country in question in this region is expanding its defense budget, except Australia, and that's going to change in September, I suspect. This is, and the United States, I need to hasten to add, is the one outlier here at the moment, and that's why the rebalancing and preservation of a strong U.S. position militarily, helping the partnership capacity of key countries, including allies like the Philippines, is very important for the U.S. policy. Growing military capabilities is not a big surprise because Asia's growing. So it is a natural sort of phenomenon to some extent. So the problem is not the growth per se. The problem is whether that growth happens within the mistrust and sort of potential miscalculation that we see at risk here in this region. So I would note that the most active security developments of late in East Asian military developments, I would argue, are actually the intra-Asian security ties that have been slowly thickening over the last few years, thickening over previous economic and diplomatic cooperation. So if you look at countries like India and Australia and Japan and Korea and their interaction with countries in Southeast Asia, you'll see a number of these bilateral, mostly security ties, deepening significantly. This is not the United States. This is the United States watching a rising Asia develop growing ties to protect Asian interests, because Asians have more capabilities. Asians have more to lose. Asians have a greater say and want more autonomy in their security. So it's somewhat anachronistic to always look to the United States to sort of say, well, you're doing all of this or you're not doing this, and we always fail the Goldilocks test of getting it just right. But we need to ensure that growing military capabilities between the U.S. and China in particular don't get out of hand. One of the ways we can build the habit of cooperation and have a practical benefit for an effective institution is an idea that came out of another project I've just finished up with my Australian friends. And Peter Leahy is the author of a new paper looking at and recommending a regionally based coordination authority based in ASEAN, similar to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, that could improve humanitarian assistance and disaster response intelligence capabilities, measures to protect populations against disasters, could nominate ready military and civil forces capable of crisis response, prepare and train military and civil response options, and conduct training exercises and administer lessons learned. That's the kind of real, effective, but cost-effective institution that could be inclusive to the region, but ASEAN-based, and then others could join from the entire region. That could help build the kind of cooperation we need. The ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus can also be part of this wider opportunity to expand military-to-military cooperation. The fourth and maybe the most important issue from a U.S. perspective, though, is reversing the zero-sum tide pulling down current Sino-U.S. relations. We are letting incidents undermine great power interests and relations, and we are reducing the scope for cooperation between two great powers, the United States and China. This isn't just my observation. This is, as Tom Nagorski, the Executive Vice President of Asia Society, noted at the outset of this conference. It was National Security Advisor Tom Donilon who noted in his speech here earlier this week that every administration, said Donilon, faces the challenge of ensuring that cascading crises do not crowd out the development of long-term strategies to deal with transcendent challenges and opportunities. So bearing in mind also Ambassador Chris Hill's observation that any war that would be likely to result in the South China Sea would be probably the result of accident or miscalculation, the United States and China need to be at the forefront and need to make a priority of expanding military-to-military contacts. It was here, again, where Donilon said that a deeper U.S.-China military-to-military dialogue is central to addressing many of the sources of insecurity and potential competition between us. And he added that we need open and reliable channels, not just one channel, channels to address perceptions and tensions about our respective activities in the short term and about our long-term presence and posture in the Western Pacific. This isn't new. We have a military maritime agreement, and we can talk about why it hasn't been fully implemented. There are questions about whether the Chinese will pick up the phone if there's an accident. If they do pick up the phone, who picks up the phone? And if somebody does pick up the phone, what does that person do or is able to do? All of those are legitimate, important questions. But this is a process. This is where you start. Again, as Senator Loosely pointed out with the Incidents at Sea Agreement, it didn't happen overnight. It was something that evolved over many years. And of course, there are other security challenges beyond the South China Sea which can help cement a better U.S.-China relationship. And one I've been working on lately, which is of an urgent requirement, is dealing with North Korean proliferation. This is a clear case of an inexperienced, reckless leader, Kim Jong-un, who is endangering great power interests and middle power interests by continuing proliferation of nuclear and missile programs on and off the peninsula. And it's reached a point now where China has reached maybe a tipping point when it understands that containing the growing WMD capability, weapons of mass destruction capability of North Korea, is now more a common interest than it is a divergent interest with the United States. That's the kind of thing we can also add to that Sino-U.S. agenda to help build confidence and trust over time and make the relationship more cooperative than competitive. If we can move forward on any and all of these areas, then the past year's continuing tensions in the South China Sea will be but the preamble to future cooperation. Thank you very much.
Great. And just yesterday, I tend to be pessimistic about South China Sea, but today we have a very optimistic tune now, started from Senator Loosely. I think three panelists address three approaches. I think all are very important for us to find a way out of this messy situation. Of course, Senator Loosely emphasized the importance to build up a structural architecture by which all the involved parties can come together and to talk and build up confidence. And I think that's a fundamental issue that has been somewhat overlooked in the South China Sea issue. That is, although everybody's trying to talk to each other, they do not have a framework architecture by which they can formalize this kind of communication. Of course, Ms. Yang Fang also addressed a very important issue about the importance of ASEAN and also the importance to find first and foremost a way, a mechanism to stabilize the situation, to manage the issue so that the issue will be not be escalated into a dangerous confrontation. And the last but not the least, of course, Patrick, as always, gave an overall solution picture how this issue can be addressed. What impressed me most is 2 points. He has 3 approaches. I think impressed me most is first, we have to advance international law on this issue. After all, this the issue involves everybody's interests. And second, he also emphasized we have to avoid a kind of security dilemma on this issue. Given Asia is growing, the military capability of Asia is also growing. So therefore, it is most important, in my view, to develop military-to-military exchanges and cooperations so that we don't get into a dangerous situation, especially between 2 major powers, that is United States and China. Mil-to-mil exchange is very important, not just for the 2 countries, but for the peace and stability in the entire region. And I really am impressed by the presentations this morning. Now the floor is open for the discussion questions. Jerry, please.
These have been very good presentations, and we all agree on what the Chinese like to say, 需要一个国强. Everything requires a process, and we have to be patient. We also agree we have to be active. A process requires stimuli and multiple efforts, and we've heard some very good suggestions about how to use the next period of time patiently, but I hope vigorously. I have a few comments and questions. First, we got to get our facts correct. Is it true, as I said yesterday, to say, as people have said this morning, China will negotiate sovereignty disputes bilaterally? Or is it true that some sovereignty disputes China won't negotiate? That's a question we have to answer. And Vietnam helped to answer that yesterday. Next point is I've heard nothing about Indonesia. Indonesia wasn't mentioned this morning. And yet it's a modest claimant. It's a huge power, at least in that context. And we'd like to know where they stand. Next, something about where law fits into this. It's not like it's either or. It's not like you go to law for a legal declaration or you go to law to make a political impact. As in this case of the Philippines, you do both. Going to law has a real function that's political and legal. If nothing else results from the Philippine case other than clarifying what is this 9-9 and does it have any contemporary legal standing, and if so, what is the scope of it? That will clarify the way for the next round of negotiations. If it's invalidated by 5 of the world's leading experts on the law of the sea, that will put the negotiations on a different footing and maybe stimulate the next step. So what should the next step be? Of course, that will, we hope, result in imaginative negotiations. And here I think it's valuable to explore the resources of international law in resolving analogous problems. Perhaps Mr. Loosely can tell us something. I gather that Australia, and I think it was New Guinea, have reached an agreement that sounded to me very imaginative, slicing up the resources in a previously unforeseen way. Maybe our international law experts, whom I'm glad to see are here this morning, can help us on that. I like the idea of strengthening regional institutions. One question, other than what Patrick has mentioned would it be useful to have in East Asia, Northeast Asia only, or Southeast Asia also, a regional court or arbitration tribunal? One of the reasons given why China traditionally doesn't want to engage in this form of third-party decision-making is a mistrust of Western views that some say goes back historically. If you had a regional institution, it would take considerable time to create, but that might be useful also because what people need on these hot law of the sea questions in East and South China Sea is a cooling off period. And if nationalism can be satisfied in all these constituencies by saying, we're going to test our claims by setting up a regional institution, etc., and stop shooting at each other, this could be useful. But maybe a court would meet resistance or an arbitration tribunal. But I think here's a chance to build up a regional institution. Of course, one doesn't want to undercut ITLOS. And how ITLOS handles this question will be an influential factor. If it seems to do a good job in a highly sensitive situation, that may diminish the need for a regional adjudicative institution. So there are many questions. I have just 3 suggestions to add to this rich stew we've been cooking up here. The first is, let's go ahead and support what the Philippines is doing. I'd like to see other countries in the region that have an interest come out one way or another, not to make the Philippines feel like a standalone leper, but to see that it's taking an enlightened step for both political and good legal reasons. And that will clear out the confusion about the 9-dash line. That's the first step. If we clear out the 9-dash line, then we can look at all these other islands and their implications. That leads to the second step. The second step should be a survey by at least the claimant littoral states, with or without China, to look at each island. If there are 130 of them, do 120 of them clearly not merit a economic zone or a continental shelf? Then you're down to a dozen or fewer. Then to try to agree by this survey, what would be reasonable claims of maritime jurisdiction for each of these islands? And does that leave an uninhibited international sea for genuine freedom of navigation without the need of the consent of any party that controls a zone? This is a lot of hard work. This would take some time. But such a survey is really feasible. After that, I think it clears the way for a detailed compromise on what the waters should be. What should be totally international waters? What should be economic zone or continental shelf waters? What should be territorial waters? And finally, one has to take account of Taiwan. Where does Taiwan fit into this situation? Ma Ying-jeou has tried in the East China Sea to develop a role for Taiwan, focusing on fisheries, as some people noted one can do as a first step toward moving on this process. But we haven't heard about what's Taiwan's position in terms of solving the South China Sea problem. We've heard less on that. And of course, Ma is an expert on the law of the sea, and he's in a position during his last 3 years to do something. Maybe one role would be when he steps down from his second final term as president, try to make him part of this international apparatus as an individual expert, not an official political leader. In any event, I think this would also push the process forward. I'm reluctant, maybe because of my age, to say, well, let's have confidence in time. These things will work themselves out. Of course they will. But the question is, do we have an obligation to stimulate them in some constructive fashion?
That's a very, very good and also penetrating questions and comments, and I leave the panelists to answer your questions. But I want to clarify on one issue about Taiwan. We did invite a Taiwanese scholar. Her name is Zheng Huiyi, Catherine Zheng, and she is a leading expert on maritime laws and from Taiwan. Actually, she is going to present a very good paper, but for some technical reasons, I understand that she held a passport that was issued in 2004. So therefore, she's not included into this new policy by United States to give her a visa. So she failed to get a visa to come to United States, which is quite unfortunate. But her paper will be included in the book chapter, in the edited volume we're going to eventually publish. So Taiwan's voice and position will be heard in our final products. And now I leave to the panelists to address some of the issues you raised just now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jerry, the joint development zone to which you referred involving Australia is Australia and Timor-Leste, East Timor. A lot of groundwork was done with Indonesia on this prior to East Timor achieving its independence. It's joint development of principally hydrocarbons to the satisfaction of both countries. That seems to be working out very well at the moment. It's a very rich area in terms of oil and gas. Your reference to Indonesia is significant. If ASEAN is central to the process of finding solutions, and I think it is, then Indonesian engagement in this process is central to the ASEAN position. At the moment, of course, there are more than passing diversions as SBY's term as president comes to an end and the election approaches. But in respect of the Philippines initiative, Indonesia does not seem to have been particularly impressed by that. The imperative of unanimity in ASEAN has always been important to Indonesia, and they like to work towards a preservation of that. But an Indonesian political and diplomatic engagement in this process is absolutely critical to achieving the kinds of outcomes that we've been discussing this morning. And I come back to the point, if we can take steps to minimise risk in the region, take out the potential for mishap, miscalculation, misadventure, a lot of other things can then be achieved once that platform is in place. But your point about Indonesia is well taken. It's absolutely central to achieving a successful outcome in the region. Could I make one more point, Mr. Chairman, which has not been made to date? And I don't think we've fallen into this trap, but sometimes we do. We ought not simply to see the South China Sea as a geographic entity in isolation of many other things that are happening in the globe, many other things that are happening in the region and beyond, in the Indian Ocean, in the Gulf and elsewhere. And people globally watch these developments. And that's a part of the process by which the stakeholders may come over time to a conclusion that their interests are best served by a series of diplomatic solutions to the problems rather than leaving issues fester. I think it's very important that we don't simply see the South China Sea issues in isolation of other things that are happening elsewhere in the globe.
A couple of quick comments. One of them is to note that indeed we do need vigor, and not just on the part of the United States, but for the United States. We could cite Robert Zoellick writing today in the Wall Street Journal about how the United States needs to be a catalyst for action to solve global problems. Well, this is exactly the kind of thing that requires and allows some U.S. participation, but it's clearly not just the U.S. It's the ASEAN countries, it's China, it's countries outside of Southeast Asia as well. The support for the Philippines is a very important point. It was in my notes. I meant to underscore it. Absolutely, the United States stands by the Philippines, not just because of the treaty, but wants to see this legal approach that is being attempted by a country weaker than the other claimant in question, China, has a fair hearing and that, as Jerry Cohen says, this can indeed clarify some very important problems or questions like this very problematic 9-dash line that seems to have no standing in contemporary international law, but I leave that to the lawyers. Getting clarity on that would indeed be a next step. Thirdly, I love the idea of a survey. This is exactly the kind of rich, sort of detailed technical work that could be done and marshaled. Mobilizing this kind of material could be very, very important, maybe presented to ASEAN when it were done. That could then allow decision makers to think what are the next steps in terms of trying to get to reasonable compromises. But that's an important bit of work. Finally, I'd mention an idea of a friend of mine, Michael McDevitt, who in his finished research project looking at the littoral basins around Eurasia at the Center for Naval Analyses, he's recommended that the State Department, the U.S. government, write an East Asian Strategy Initiative report, if you will, that is delves into the legal framework and legal issues from a U.S. perspective. How does the U.S. see these issues? Trying to put out at least an objective look from a U.S. perspective of the legal questions. It doesn't have to settle these issues. This is tricky business, very tricky business, and it may be that it's better done by an outside academic institution with government funding to say that it's not an official government document, but rather it's trying to lend greater clarity to this regional survey and where law stands. But it would remove some of the ambiguity in U.S. policy as well, but there would still be ambiguity. Ambiguity is what every policy maker, period, small or big, wants to retain in executive authority, because that's gives you more options for making future policy.
Thank you, Professor, for your good suggestions and the comments. So I would like to answer the questions. Does China have the political will to solve the sovereignty or to negotiate the South China Sea issue on a bilateral basis? We do have some of the experience, China's experience to solve the sovereignty issue on the land boundary with all the neighboring countries, except India and Bhutan. But for the rest of the neighboring countries, China has always negotiated and finally reached the solution based on a bilateral basis. So it's based on China's experience. But in the South China Sea, China has a very long-term based vision, and has a greater patience and try to keep the status quo, to have the priority to stabilize the situation and try to have the priority to implement the DOC. But we also have to recognize the Southeast Asia countries. They are facing very pressing issues on a daily basis. They are heavily dependent on the fishing activity, fishery resource, and energy demand. So that's why I suggest China have to accommodate the ASEAN countries' interest, how to engage them to cooperate, to conduct joint cooperation, and to address the common interests and also common threats. And this also could provide opportunity for Taiwan to participate in this process. And China actually have the initiative after November 2011, when China signed the guideline to implement the DOC, and China have some initiatives to cooperate with the ASEAN countries and provide fundings and capability. Also conduct a series of workshops with ASEAN countries and do the research, and also conduct some of the joint scientific research and disaster relief projects with these countries. So perhaps this could be the first step to start. And when the tension is calmed down and the situation is more stabilized, that perhaps China and the ASEAN countries, they could move forward to talk about the sovereignty issue.
On the islands.
Yeah, the sovereignty issue I think is possibly could be negotiated between, two parties. China has negotiated the boundary issue in Gulf of Tonkin with Vietnam. So that could be one of the successful cases.
Okay. Yeah, Henry.
Thank you, Professor. First, thank you to the panel speakers. I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you to all the speakers. I'd like to state at the beginning, I have a comment and a question, actually. First is that I'd like to state that in theory, joint development will work if done in the right area and under the right conditions. Having said that, when you have a 9-dash line, it is very good for whoever that coastal state who claims almost the entire South China Sea to have joint development as an alternative. Why? Because when you're claiming everything to the extent of 85% of Philippine EEZ, 85% of Malaysian EEZ, 85% of Brunei's EEZ, 35% of Indonesian EEZ, and about 90% of Vietnamese EEZ, it makes a lot of sense to have joint development because you're able to actually gain from something where you have no rights from the very beginning. Having said that, the zone of peace, and I will have to react to that, is the political counterpart of the legal arbitration. And I'm very grateful, actually, that Sir Cohen here mentioned about the specific steps, because SOFIC is about those specific steps. It provides the roadmap that makes joint development possible, actually. And these are the very specific guideposts for us to arrive to a viable, feasible, and fair joint development. In capsule, let me explain what that is. It's essentially when it distinguishes, and this is what I have to correct, it does not address the territorial issue. On the contrary, it makes a distinction between territorial issues, which is something to do with the question of who owns the islands, versus the maritime issue, which is not about territorial issue. By making this distinction, we have to set aside the territorial issue because it takes centuries. Maritime question, however, is something that is easier to address. What we're saying here, therefore, in terms of the political SOFIC, is that while we are not able to solve the territorial dispute, we can go about clarifying first the maritime issue. It's like in this room. If there are 100 people in this room, and there are 7 people with bird flu, a very infectious disease, it's very difficult for the 100 people to coordinate and cooperate with each other. Why? Because people are afraid to be infected by this highly infected. So what is the usual logical approach? You separate the 7 people, put them in a quarantine area, so that the 93 people who are healthy are able to interact in a very healthy way. While the 7 people, you are trying to invent the right medicine so that at the right time, they will be cured. But the 7 people will not block the 93 people from interacting with each other. This is essentially SOFIC. We try to pinpoint exactly and clarify where the territorial dispute on the basis of the land dominating the sea. And once we have identified that, we apply Article 121. And then by doing that, you're able to enclave them essentially as a way of isolating them. By doing so, you have actually allowed the bigger portion of the South China Sea, by which all of the areas mentioned by Ms. Yang could be blossomed, actually. Having said that, it is noteworthy, actually, that SOFIC, the way it was addressed, it's noteworthy that when this was put to the table and it was trying to move forward, it's very unfortunate that 2 countries did not come to make sure that there's no consensus. And then at the same time, towards the end of the year in the summit, we took note that instead of having SOFIC, why not discuss COC? And so there's a diversion, and we agreed. However, when COC actually was on the table, it's not the Philippines, it's not ASEAN who put a stop to that or stop. I just want to state that as a matter of fact. Now, to my question, therefore, I wish to ask for some clarification from Yang, how she arrived. There was a statement in your PowerPoint which says the arbitration is politically motivated and it is just done for the show. That's the impression I got because as you pointed out, it's done to humiliate actually China. I wonder, you did not make an explanation how you arrive at that conclusion. I would be very interested to know how you have come up with that conclusion. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you very much for sharing the context of the Philippines proposal for the peace, freedom, and the friendship zone, and also your point of view of the difficulties to conduct joint cooperation with China. We certainly agree with you that the Chinese model, there's some of the different distrust from the ASEAN countries' perspective. They may worry that the joint cooperation with China may jeopardize the ASEAN countries' their interest to claim the South China Sea. And you mentioned that where is the right area to conduct joint cooperation. The Philippines, as the case in 2005 to 2008, that the Philippines, they strongly disagreed that the area is located largely within the Philippines zone. So how about to move, to the central area? There is maybe the area maybe is not within any particular country's EEZ. Why not start with the first project could be done by identifying an area that's agreed by all parties. That could be the first step to start the joint cooperation. I'm sure there's an area that there's no overlap of all these countries, the claimed area. And you want me to clarify why I say the political impact of the Philippines submission to United Nations and Tribunal. I'm not a legal expert, so I have no certainty on the result of the legal proceedings. But I'm sure that the Philippines would have, of course, could achieve some political objective. That's the basic achievement. I agree with I'm sure that they have confidence on the Philippines approach. So I think that even the process is uncertain, that it could help to pressure China and try to bring the issue to the legal track, and how to think about the effectiveness of using the legal approach. But the basic achievement, it could confront China and on the moral high ground, whether it has a legitimate basis to claim the South China Sea based on the Line-9. So that's my opinion, that the Philippines could achieve in the basic level. That's the political achievement. And I'm sorry that I can't foresee the result of this submission, so I can't expect or I can't make the conclusion on the legal issues.
Thank you very much. Lan Anh from Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Thank you for very wonderful presentation of the panelists. I have a comment. I think that the South China Sea disputes have moved beyond a pure territorial and maritime dispute, and it become a very complicated issue in the regions. Because, as you just mentioned before, there is a certain possibility that the South China Sea may exceed the high sea, and in that high sea, maybe other states in the world may have the right. And it also connected to the navigation interest, that the common interest of so many other partners in the world. So it's not within the claimant in the regions. And as far as the interest of the other relevant, or I can call it sea user, is under threatened, they automatically have their legitimate interest to participate in the dispute. So it's not a matter of strategic balancing by using the involvement of the big power, but it's a matter of the interest of other sea users in the South China Sea. And in order to address this very complicated issue in the South China Sea, I'm totally agree with the two presenters that architecture is very important, in which ASEAN have to play the centrality role. And of course, in order to address the South China Sea, it's very difficult for ASEAN, because you can see that many ASEAN countries have different interests and different point of view. But at the very general point of view, you can see that they share the common interest of peace and stability of the regions. And as long as 2015, ASEAN become a community, you can see that the South China Sea is a space for connectivity of all the countries in the region. It's not something separate them, but it's something connect them all together. And you have to, I think that I just would like to draw the attention that there's certain aspect that you can still hope for the active role of ASEAN, because up to last year, ASEAN can contribute quite actively role to the South China Sea dispute. The AMM 45 is just an unusual failure of ASEAN, and it was corrected by the 6-point principle initiated by Indonesia. And also, in order to make an effort to dispute settlement, we can see that the country in the region, as well as ASEAN, should be based on the rule-based approach, and in which we have so many measures to promote that rule-based approach. First, we can encourage the claimant to clarify their claim in accordance with international law and UNCLOS. We also can follow the suggestion of Professor Cohen to identify the status of the feature in the Spratly and the paracels. And we can also think about provide support for the Philippine initiatives that is also based on the rule approach. And I also think that there are some of the presenters point out that there's some ASEAN countries quite low in raising their voice, so that kind of forum can maybe in the future invite more other claimant or ASEAN countries, so encouraging or providing the forum for them to have their voice. And by that way, we can have a more comprehensive point of view to arrive at a more appropriate solution. Thank you.
I am a former Chief of National Health Statistics at the United Nations. And I've been to many Asian countries, also in China, many times, at least for the last 5 or 6 years as a consultant to National Bureau of Statistics of China. So I consider myself as a friend of China, and I like the idea of cooperation. So, but let's see. I think people talk a lot about cooperation here. So I am unclear about the reason or something behind the statement of China. And I look into the statement of Deng Xiaoping, right, a long time ago, and he said that 主算手我遏制让倡议共同开发. It means that sovereignty belongs to me, to us. set aside the disputes and then cooperate. So the question that most foreigners in this conference, when they discuss about cooperation, they do not mention the first statement of Deng Xiaoping, means that sovereignty belongs to us. So mean that, we can cooperate, but you should recognize, you should accept that the sovereignty in the South China Sea belongs to China. Now the question that raised by the ambassador from the Philippines is the same. You have China claim the U-shaped line, and that U-shaped line has overlapped with the EEZ of countries. So the area that can have a cooperation is only the area of overlapping, right? The rest is Chinese territory. So I think that, if we would like to have cooperation, what we should look is that we should exactly forget about sovereignty. We forget about that. And we talk about how to share the resources in the sea. And there are many formulas for sharing the resources. For example, by the share of the coast of the littoral states. So if you base on that share, you can count that the Philippines has about 24%, Vietnam has 20%, China has 20%, Brunei has about 3-4%, and Malaysia has about 6%. So everyone has a share. Now, if we really talk about cooperation and we forget about sovereignty, now when the Philippines brings to the issue to the tribunal, it means that it clarifies the issue. It clarifies which is a rock, which is not a rock, which is an island, so that the area that to reduce the area that people can claim sovereignty, and so that the rest can be shared. So you zone in the small area of dispute in terms of foreign sovereignty, and the rest we talk about cooperation. So I would like to ask the colleagues from China to clarify what is the basis of cooperation here. Yeah. And I think that we forget one sentence of Deng Xiaoping. If we include it in, we should also, when we talk about cooperation, we also talk about that. We should talk about that. Thanks.
Okay. General Zhou.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, if you look at the exploration of the resources in South China Sea, I think people can see the restraint that Chinese have exercised in the past years. It is not that we are not short of resources. It's not that we are short of the capability to carry out the exploration of oil and gas in South China Sea. However, up to now, we don't have a single well in the disputed areas in spraggly areas. That fully shows that China has restrained itself very much in this regard. I believe that the sovereignty issue is a very, very complicated issue. I don't think any wise people in the world, there is any wise people in the world today has the capability to solve the sovereignty issue in South China Sea. Therefore, Chinese have advocated that carry out joint exploration of the resources there, so as to serve the economic development of the different countries in these areas. I believe that the cooperation shall not exclude Chinese, because China is is one of the claimants. And I believe that if Chinese carry out the exploration of oil in the future in this area, it should be understood by others. Because exploration should include China. This is one. Secondly, I would suggest that if Center for Asia and Globalization can work out a list of the problems to be cooperated in the future by the different parties concerned. And if the center can also work out a list of the issues need to be addressed, which can proceed from easy to difficult. And I insist that sovereignty issue is very difficult. I don't think the center is of the capability. But in promoting the cooperation of exploration and development, I think this is quite easy. And the Center for Asian Globalization is quite independent. And Singapore is actually a center not only in the academia, but also the brain of ASEAN. And Chinese appreciate the efforts of Singaporean side very much. Therefore, I believe that Singapore is in the right position, or an academic institution in Singapore is in the right position to promote this sort of study in the future. What I want to emphasize, I don't know why Chinese are always criticized in the exploration of the resources. I think outsiders may misunderstood China. I don't know what Chinese have done in spratly areas, even though we have some islands there. We have occupied 7 islands and the reefs there. However, we don't have a single well. How about the other countries? Nowadays, there are more than 60 oil companies. More than 1,000 oil wells have been drilled. And every year, more than 50 million tons of oil have been exploited by different countries and different companies. But we don't have a single well. So I don't know what China has done to obstruct the development, joint development. So I hope that this sort of study should be realistic and objective. So don't try to take the political issues onto the disputes. Of course, territorial dispute is a political issue. But if you look at it, if you are emotional, I don't think that's the way to seek any a solution to the issues like joint exploration or cooperation in the development, or in seeking resolution to disputes over the territories, etc. So it's very, very difficult. So I hope that the Chinese stand will be understood. Thank you.
Professor Zhang, yes.
Since I heard 2 different views, I believe that it's very important to clarify the condition for, I don't think for cooperation. Cooperation is too vague for joint development as a matter of law and clause. So the condition is very important, but I heard different views. One view seems from my friend Henry, it sounds that, what is that condition? It seems that you have to have something there, otherwise you cannot get what you want by joint cooperation. In that sense, I remember the Filipinos. What is this design of what is the area for cooperation and friendship? The Philippines present if I remember clearly, stated that ours is ours, and it's none of your business. So if I decide that's ours, there's no way to do any joint development here. So this is one view. The other view is the previous question coming from a gentleman seat in front of me. His view is somehow like Deng Xiaoping said, well, I will claim this under our sovereignty, and that is a condition. So when China tried to request to ask the others to have the joint development, be careful. Deng Xiaoping is kind of, it could be somehow inferred that he's quite hypocritical because he hides the sovereignty claim before suggesting the cooperation. So in that sense, you can only cooperate if you don't have anything, if I understand correctly. So if you suggest joint development, so the precondition is you forget about the sovereignty, forget about the first sentence that Deng Xiaoping will say. So that Philippine people will completely disagree with this view. Well, I find that the Chinese, as I made a presentation yesterday, the Chinese policy on this set-aside dispute and joint development is quite in between these two. This is very important, of course, and as a matter of law, you only can have this joint development in this disputed area. But also important, countries always have differences on what is disputed. So I think our position, China's position is that, so let's talk first where is disputed. We need to have a negotiation rather than to, like some of the country will say, no way, ours is ours. It's not business of yours. And it's also not the opposite be expressed in some else. That is my general observation from what I heard. Thank you.
Since we're already over time now, and I think we should have a few minutes to our panelists have a final word on this. And sorry that our panel is due to 11:20. Now it's a few minutes over 11:20. Let's start the opposite way. I think, Patrick, do you have a few words to say to wrap up?
I want to end on a positive note. I'm going to resist saying anything critical about some of the comments. Well, okay, all right, I'll say one critical thing. I mean, my friend General Zhu, I'm very glad that the PLA is deeply interested in the energy business. One of the interesting things that's been happening in China that countries interested in energy have noted is that China is independently building the means for deep sea drilling. They've had some problems there, but also pipeline and seismic surveys. That's different from everybody else in the region. Everybody else relies on the same set of contractors to do this business. So one of the things, while you're right, China's not now benefiting, and that is a problem. And that's why we want to rule of law to figure out how to make China benefit as well. At the same time, China's doing things in a way that is intimidating the region in a sense because of its capability. It's just a big power, and it's gaining this kind of power. So recognizing the signals that are being sent by Chinese actions that are intended and unintended is an important thing for any big power to recognize, just as the United States often steps on the toes of many actors around the world, often unintentionally. The positive note is that nothing that I've heard in these last 2 days has led me to believe that war is imminent. Yes, Jerry Cohen's absolutely right. Time is a-wasting, but so vigilance every single minute. Activity, yes. Purposeful, effective institution building, absolutely. The United States is focused on working with especially Southeast Asian nations and ASEAN because this is such a vital area and because the South China Sea matters so much. It's trying to build a constructive, cooperative relationship with China, and there's a lot of meeting an overlapping interest there that we've heard from Tom Donnellan, we've heard from Professor Zhu, General Zhu, and others, where even on the military-to-military dimension, these areas now are of a shared concern. And the South China Sea is really a regional and a global public good, so we do have to come together and make sure that we can sort out these areas. And I think starting with the kind of clarification on the 9- U-shaped line would go a long way toward clearing the water, clearing the seas, toward cooperation that we all want to see happen. So thank you very much.
I would like to address a few more a little more on the joint development issues. We have different versions. I'm from both Philippines and China. There concerns the difficulties of conduct joint cooperation. We understand that the domestic concern on this issue. The Philippines, they concern that it is unfair to cooperate in the Philippine claimed area, and China, they also domestically, they also have the pressure from public. They say there's no single well in the South China Sea. So they also have the different interpretation of the the condition of joint cooperation. So I totally agree with Professor Zhang and how to clarify the conditions and then to try to have the negotiation on the basic level. So perhaps maybe they also have to receive the endorsement from ASEAN. I think the ASEAN certainly have a role to play in this issue. And I'm still quite positive that joint development could be addressed and to offer the one way to cooperate and to address the more pressing issues, to accommodate all the common interests and also to address the common threats. So that's my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the Lee Kuan Yew School for giving me the privilege of being the final comment from the panel. To reaffirm, we should not see these issues in the South China Sea in isolation of other developments and other imperatives and other pressures that are happening elsewhere in the globe. And it's not simply a matter of the stakeholders being engaged, global opinion is engaged in terms of the resolution of the issues that are before us at this conference and in other fora. Confidence building measures over time can serve to minimise risk and dramatically to reduce the possibility of a mishap, misadventure or an accident. Again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have done this previously at a global level. If the tensions are reduced and the risks are reduced, then it's possible to negotiate, and ASEAN has a central role here, to negotiate some joint economic development, not necessarily based on the 9- line, to take that off the agenda. The joint economic zones have worked and can work, and obviously it's based on mutual benefit. And when mutual benefit prevails, people naturally see their own interests as being served. This circumstance may well lead to the possibility of a treaty. The Antarctic Treaty is offered as one model of how to take matters forward in terms of developing protocols for settling of issues and, again, dramatically reducing the possibility of conflict. And I agree very much with Patrick's comment. I think the possibility of conflict over these issues is remote. To conclude, if we have successfully built those platforms and we've built trust, we've reduced suspicions, and there's a pattern of conduct amongst the stakeholders, the broad stakeholders in the region, then there is no reason why regional architecture can't be the final part of the process by which these issues can be discussed, can be deliberated upon and can be resolved. If that's the ASEAN Regional Forum, well and good. I don't think anyone favours creating an additional organisation, but find a vehicle which is appropriate, an architecture which serves the purpose of peace and prosperity in the region and well beyond. Thank you.
Okay, that brought us to a conclusion, but before that, I use my privilege as a chairman to address two minor issues raised by the audience. First, I just cannot help because I did a lot of study about Deng Xiaoping and how he raised the issue. And yes, Deng Xiaoping did say that the sovereignty is mine and shelve the dispute and going for cooperations. But as all the political leaders, Deng Xiaoping has to deal with the two audiences. The first audience is a domestic audience. The second audience is external audience. So when Deng Xiaoping said, 主权在我, that is, sovereignty is mine, he's actually talking to the Chinese, to people like him. Basically, he's to calm down the internal dispute, internal difference, so that it will not get into a way of his reform policy. He said, that's why, let's stop this. Okay, we believe the sovereignty is mine. That's it. And then when his second sentence, he said, shelve the dispute, he began to turn into external years. The first sovereignty is mine, he's talking to the domestic years. And then he said that if you look at the nuance, he actually denied himself in the second one, that is, shelve the dispute. Because if you think sovereignty is mine, then you should dispute about it. You should tell people that it's mine. But I say, let's don't talk about it. So on part of it, he talked to his own comrades. Let's don't talk about it because it's too much. And then he began to turn the external years. Let's shelve the dispute and then focus on joint cooperation, joint development. Now, in the process, he started from domestic years and then go transfer to the external years. That's why the two versions of Deng Xiaoping's words on this. The first version is the internal version. When the internal version, they always started with sovereignty is mine. But if you look at all the external document for external uses, Chinese never mention the first one, Deng Xiaoping. There is a purpose in it. I think a nuance should be understood by sophisticated scholars and like this. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that Deng Xiaoping is dealing with two different, quite different audience when he said that. So that should be understood. And the second point is my good friend General Zhu's point. Yes, Center on Asia and Globalization do care about what's going on in the South China Sea. Thank you for giving us a suggestion. And yes, that's why we're here to bring all the people from Vietnam, from Philippines, from China, from Singapore, and we could bring people from Taiwan to discuss this. We do want to find out exactly what the problem is, why it's so complicated, and if possible, find a way out for cooperation. But as you understand, we are academic institutions. We do take side, but we take side with the fact and the reality. We don't take side for the claimants. So our purpose, like we're going to emphasize later, is for academic purposes. And we respect the freedom of academic research. And we understand the complexity in terms of politics. However, we just cannot pretend that we have a position or political position on this. We don't. At least consciously, we don't want to do that. We only take side from fact, and I hope our friends from all the other countries understand that. And having said that, please join me to give a round to our panelists. And also the conclusion of this conference. Andrew, we still have about a few minutes to make the concluding remarks. Andrew will, on behalf of Asia Society, will give us a few words.
Well done.
Yes, if I could just add very quickly here at the end, thank you again for making, for some of you, the very long journey over here to New York from Asia. It's been a pleasure to host all of you here. We've heard obviously a number of very interesting perspectives from a legal basis, from a historical basis, political, and at the regional and global level. I think we can stress perhaps that domestic issues in all of the claimant countries play a role with respect to this issue. And with some of the domestic issues resolved, we can perhaps make more gains internationally and simultaneously manage the dispute more effectively. To that end, I think one of our panelists suggested that ASEAN might be prioritized as an enabler of resolution of this dispute, and I think that is a reasonable proposition, if nothing else because we all gain from improved economic and political cooperation on this issue, and that then translates into gains on the domestic front as well, as I mentioned. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, as our panel suggested, and thank you again for the good conversation. I should just add that here at Asia Society, as most of you know, we are a very diverse institution. We have programs that transcend a number of different issue areas, whether arts, culture, policy, business, and even education. And from that perspective, I think we will all perhaps have a better and improved understanding of each other and our positions on these very difficult political and security challenges. So if I could just conclude by mentioning actually an exhibit that's happening right now in our museum, which is the Artful Recluse, which is an exhibit of 17th century Chinese paintings and artwork. And as many of you probably know, the 17th century in China was a period of transition, a period where China had to deal with the possibility of threats from foreign invaders, and perhaps there are some takeaways from examining that artwork and poetry that's on display downstairs in the museum. So if you're interested on your way out of the building, just let our reception desk know that you would like to see that exhibit, and they would be happy to accommodate you in that respect. I'd like to also remind our panelists that you're all invited for a final lunch together here in the back room. And again, please, all of you, feel free to reach out to Asia Society at any point. And we're delighted to have cooperated with Professor Huang on this issue and the Lee Kuan Yew School and Center on Asia and Globalization, and we look forward to future cooperation. So thank you.
So we hope that those who present the paper to this conference will go back and to revise your paper in a format that can be published in a book chapter. We hope you can put it between 5,000 to 8,000 words as manageable. And I hope you can get it done by the end of May, because we really want to get the book out late this year or early next year. So thank you so much for your cooperation. Please give us your final draft in late May. We are going to send you an email to detail the format, all of this, and deadlines. The first point I want to make. The second point, which is the last point, is that we hope we understand this is a conference for academic purposes, and we try to be as inclusive as possible in terms of substance and participants. However, let me emphasize, all the views presented, discussed at this forum belongs to the person who presented himself or herself. I do not want people to take this as a kind of places where the government can voice opinions. You can learn some nuance, but the views are based on the individual rights. We do not pretend that we're going to get any government officials to present a view here. So no more, no less, just individual scholars or experts' own view and opinion based on the principle of freedom of academic expression. I hope this be remembered and understood. Thank you so much.